Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm joined by two Christian apologists that are somewhat new to the scene. If you have never heard of them, you need to know about them. What they're doing is they're presenting today on why theism is a good explanation of reality. They've got a more technical title for their presentation, something about the explanatory power of theism. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to give both of my guests, Tim Howard and Kyle Alander, just a little bit of time at the very beginning of this to just introduce themselves. But again, what we're talking about today is why theism is a really good explanation of reality. And this is going to be, I'm just going to give you a warning. This is going to be on the more intermediate, advanced side of things. So if you're not super familiar with apologetics, this might be a little bit difficult for you to get through today. But that's okay, because every now and then we need to go deeper. We need to really investigate and think hard about philosophy and theism and God's existence and everything. And so this is going to be that. If you are that person, which I am that person, I want to go deeper, then this is going to be the show for you today. So with that, let's get to some introductions. So Tim, take it away. Take about 60 seconds. Just introduce yourself to the audience. Talk about your channel a little bit, and then we'll pass it over to Kyle.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me on and allowing me to do this. Been following the channel for a long time, and so this is kind of just a pretty good dream come true, and being able to present a lot of the things that I myself and also Kyle as well have been working on for the past few years, moving up on our philosophical journey. But yeah, my name's Tim Howard. I run the channel Invoking Theism. That's my Instagram, that's my Twitter, and that's my YouTube channel. Planning on uploading a lot more this year. If you want to keep up with my more intimate thoughts, you can keep up with me on Twitter. But basically, my interests are mainly in philosophy of religion, but more specifically, metaphysics, natural theology, some philosophy of mind, ontology, things like that, and a lot of philosophy of probability, a lot of philosophy of science. And I've taken a philosophy of science and philosophy of probability turn like the past year, almost 2 years. And so if you go to my channel, I'm going to be talking about things like analytic theology, analytic philosophy. Just did a video on evolution. I'm coming out with another very long video on evolution, evolutionary evils, the datum of evolution, how that fares on theism in more of an abductive slash more probabilistic case. I am heavily a Swinburnian when it comes to my approach to natural theology and when it comes to my approach to God's existence and how I think about this whole thing. So yeah, I'm also 23 years old and not currently in college at the moment.
Yeah, so both of these guys are very young, which is really cool. I mean, that's one of the things I love to do every now and then is to introduce you guys to newer apologists that are coming onto the scene. And both of these guys, just I think that they're sort of just getting started here. And Kyle, in fact, he kind of made his like public debut, so to speak, recently with the whole like 1 in a million comment that was made by Dr. Craig and then picked up by all of these atheists online and everything. And that was actually Kyle's question that he sent to Dr. Craig, Reasonable Faith. And yeah, so Kyle has had a little bit of exposure, but we're going to do a whole lot more exposure today. But yeah, Kyle, go ahead and take about the same amount of time, about 60 seconds, introduce yourself to the audience.
Right. So thank you, first of all, Cameron, for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've been followed your channel for many years now. And I guess, so my approach is very similar to Tim. And the research that I've been doing for the past few years has been, before I got into philosophy of religion, I mostly was in philosophy of mind, so debates about consciousness. But these past few years, I have been more heavily focused on the philosophy of religion and going into that field. More recently, I've been researching probability theory, so same as Tim. So me and Tim have, we work together on these projects. And on my channel right now, I'm sort of building a cumulative case for theism. So it's called what I call Swinburne's nuke. And basically, it's based off the work of Swinburne himself. Right. So I kind of take what he does and I kind of update it and, make it better than how he presents it. So that's sort of the approach that I take. And coming up this year, I'm going to be doing a lot more content, a lot more videos on my channel. going over these, concepts. So yeah, I appreciate having. Thanks for having me on, Cameron.
Yeah, and so let's now talk about the presentation that you guys are talking about today. Give us like a quick overview of what someone can expect if they watch this video in full, because this is going to be a pretty long video. It's going to be about an hour and a half, 2 hours long. So what can someone expect if they watch the whole thing? Tim, why don't you go ahead and...
Okay, so what they can expect from this presentation is what we're trying to do is we're trying to show how theism as a grand metaphysical theory of reality really does fare as a fierce competitor to other grand theories of reality. And so the way that we taxonomize grand theories of reality, I think there's three ways you can do it. I think that there's theism, I think that there's axiarchism, and I think that there's atheism. And this is taken from Ted Post's paper on how to ground intrinsic probabilities and how he grounds the intrinsic probability of theism. And he taxonomizes it in that way as well. And I think that when we compare all three metaphysical grand theories of reality, theism actually has a lot of innate resources as a kind of explanation to really put those other theories against the fence. And that's what we're trying to show. And so we're not coming here today to show, here's some brand new argument for God's existence that you've never heard before. Here's some new novel datum that we just dug up the other day or something like that. Rather, what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a very methodologically sound and rigorous framework for how to think about theistic evidence. Kind of think about it the way in contemporary theoretical physics, right? That you have a kind of model and system for how to think about different theories of quantum mechanics, right now, quantum field theory. But there are differing theories about, well, the overall quantum datum, if you want to call it that. And so there's string theoretic models, there's more emergent space-time models and things of that sort. And they each, within their own paradigms, have ways of framing and modeling evidence and thinking about the physics paradigm as a whole. And that's exactly what we're doing with theism, is we're trying to show that theism functions the exact same way. And we're trying to give people a very straightforward guide to thinking about that. Because often it's been thought that theism really isn't a good explanation, given certain characteristics and attributes of God. There are certain perceived deficits and demerits that theism has. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to dispel that and show, well, here is how theism actually functions very well as an explanation, following a lot of the heavily discussed principles of the philosophy of science, philosophy of probability, and things of that sort. So again, very Swinburnian in that way. And it's going to be inherently cumulative, and it's going to be inherently abductive in its approach. And so that's the way I want to set the stage up. And then the content will fill itself out. So.
Well, you guys already have been debunked in the live chat. Someone says magic is not an explanation. So should we just end the stream? Should we?
Honestly, go to bed.
Kyle, is there anything that you'd like to add before we get started on the presentation?
Not really. I mean, I guess the basic point is we're not presenting a new argument. We're not necessarily, it's not like this is a new argument or this is, we just dug this up the other day. This is more of a framework of how to look at theistic evidence and how we can take the evidence we have and incorporate it into an explanatory framework. So that's what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah. So this is, it's not going to be like a new argument for the existence of God. This is more of just a way of understanding how theism can operate as an explanation. And it'll along the way, it'll address some objections that you may have seen from certain atheists online, and there's also a section at the very end of the presentation where they cover objections. And in that section, you can kind of see how their framework that they build is going to easily respond to some of these objections that get thrown out sometimes. So, all right, let's go ahead and just jump into the presentation. I'll pull up the scene. Whenever you guys are ready, just take it away. And just quick reminder to both of you guys that I will be adjusting the slides manually. So when you want to advance to the next one, just let me know and I'll do it on my end.
All right, no problem, Cam. So we agreed I'll start off the presentation and then we'll switch over to Tim once we get to his section. So next, start off first slide. So today we're going to be going over, this is the main outline of this presentation. So number one is epistemic probability. Number two is the axiology framework and background knowledge. Number 3 is the actual evidence for theism itself. And then number 4 is just answering some objections. So this is the outline of the entire presentation. Next slide. So first, let's start off with epistemic probability. So next slide. So epistemic probability is defined as a degree to which one proposition makes another likely. Now, there are two main types of epistemic probability. The first one is what's called non-basic probabilities. So these are the probabilities that are determined by the values of other probabilities. And then you have what's called basic probabilities, which is like sort of like the foundation of probability theory. So Nevin Klamahanga, he's a probabilistic philosopher. He says that basic probabilities are basically the elementary quantities out of which other probabilities are built, or they're the atoms of probability theory. So I think understanding these two main distinctions between basic probabilities and non-basic probabilities is important, because there's actually debate. There's great debates among probabilists about what is basic versus what's not a basic, because there's different views about this. So next slide. So there's two questions when it comes to probability theory. The first question asks, what probabilities are basic? And the second question asks, how are the values of these basic probabilities determined? Now, for the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on the first one specifically. So which probabilities are basic? So next slide. So there's two views about which probabilities are basic. So the first view is what's called orthodox Bayesianism. And on orthodox Bayesianism, the basic probabilities are the unconditional probabilities of. And so if you accept this view of probability theory, you would say that the intrinsic world is.
Sorry, Kyle, it kind of cut out. It kind of cut out a little bit. I think we're having some internet connectivity issues. Start over where you were just starting to explain orthodox Bayesianism.
Okay, yeah. So orthodox Bayesianism would basically say that basic probabilities are the unconditional probabilities of complete worlds. And so on this view, then you would sort of entail that the intrinsic probability of a world is the total number of claims it makes. So typically, this is cashed out in terms of modesty and coherence. And of course, finally, on orthodox Bayesianism, only some probabilities are conditional. So not all probabilities are going to be conditional on this view, because you can have some what's called unconditional probabilities. Now, in case the audience is not aware, an unconditional probability is basically any probability that's not conditional evidence, right? So you don't have evidence that you look at, but rather you just look at the hypothesis itself, right? Now, it's a little bit different on explanationism, because on explanationism, basic probabilities are the probabilities of atomic propositions conditional on potential direct explanations, right? So on this view, the prior probability or even intrinsic probability is going to be determined by higher order theories. And on this view, all probabilities are conditional. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is going to be sort of like a defense against some objections that might come up later. So the reason why we're sort of laying out these two views is to just show that if you're going to make an objection to our presentation later on based on orthodox Bayesianism, well, we don't accept orthodox Bayesianism. We hold to an explanationist view of Bayesianism, right? So in explanationism, the intrinsic probability of a world is a function of how simple are the highest level hypotheses which it contains, and how well they are able to explain all of the other propositions which the world contains. So in this sort of view of probability, it's not about the number of claims that a hypothesis makes that makes it more or less likely, but rather it's about the relationships between propositions and how one proposition can explain another proposition, right? So it doesn't matter how many propositions your worldview has, right? But rather what's going to matter is how well are your propositions able to explain other propositions. So that's basically the idea. And the reason why I sort of, we propose this view is because this will, again, as I said earlier, this is going to really bypass a lot of the objections that come up later. So you can go to the next slide. So these are some of the advantages to explanationism. Now, I'm not going to get into every single one here, but if you guys want more references, there's a paper by Nevin Klamahanga. It's called The Structure of Epistemic Probabilities, and these are kind of the 5 main arguments he gives in this paper. So the first advantage is that conditional probabilities of atomic propositions may be well defined when associated unconditional state descriptions probabilities are not. So the second one is the probabilities of explanationism identifies as basic can be more directly perceived than those that orthodoxies identifies as basic. So basically, I don't want to go through every single one here, but there are like arguments in support of the explanationist view over the orthodox view. I don't know if Tim has anything else to add, but I think it's his turn to.
No, that's
You
good.
can
Yeah,
go
we can
ahead.
go to the next
Yeah.
one. Okay, yeah. So now we can discuss how we are viewing epistemic probabilities, because there are many different views of epistemic probabilities. And so a lot of the work that we're citing is leaning on Nevin Clemenhaga's work. And in 2022, he released a paper on the degree of support interpretation of epistemic probability, which is basically the fact that probabilities, or epistemic probabilities for short, are mind-independent support relations between propositions, which is, if you want to know what the probability of A given B is, it's just simply the degree to which B supports A and the unconditional probability of A as the degree to which A is supported by a priori truths or tautologies. And so this idea is that we have these degree of support relations, and in the past, epistemic probabilities have not been seen in terms of degrees of support, but in terms of degrees of belief or subjective degrees of belief. And so what Nevin is trying to do with this is he's trying to get to more of what can be seen as a maybe quasi-logical probability in a kind of propositional calculus, where basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, like, what is the actual support relations between these propositions, and how are we able to see their degree of confirmation, which is ultimately what a probability is. And so that's ultimately going to help us when we're doing our comparative analysis against other theories, coming with this understanding of epistemic probability. This is going to provide the groundwork and the ground understanding for how we are actually assigning probabilities, how we are actually grounding our probabilities. So we also take the positive relevance view of evidence. And so the positive relevance view of evidence is defined as E is evidence for H, if and only if the probability of H given E is greater than the probability of H. That is, if and only if E raises the probability of H above what it was when E was not taken into account. And so that's Roche 2003 defending that against objections. And so a lot of probabilists and a lot of evidentialists hold to a positive relevance view of evidence, that evidence is probability raising. Not all evidentialists and not all philosophers of probability and philosophers of evidence agree with this view, but this view, and I'm not going to go into doing a full-blown defense of it here. There's going to be a lot of programmatic assumptions going into this, but we do think that this view coheres very well with explanationism and the degree of support interpretation of epistemic probability. And so when we're thinking about evidence, this is exactly how we're defining it in this very clear analytic manner. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the axiological framework and background knowledge. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so background knowledge. If you're familiar with Swinburne, he lays out 4 explanatory criteria, and one of those is background knowledge. And if you also know, is Swinburne actually reduces background knowledge in his work, in his defense of God's existence, to actually simplicity. Now, he's been critiqued by other philosophers of science and atheist philosophers for doing that, and they actually think that there is an argument that can be said that we should actually keep background knowledge when we can. Background knowledge is important. It's a way that we can actually ground probabilities. If we're comparing 2 theories and one fits with background knowledge and the other one doesn't, the one that fits with background knowledge is going to be more probable because it's already meshing with inquiry and other places of knowledge that we understand. So this criterion assesses whether the postulated explanation meshes with other explanations. So an explanation fits with background knowledge if the causes or entities invoked by the explanation are similar to those causes or entities that are taken to exist within other neighboring fields. And so if you think about, we don't postulate fairies in physics, or we don't postulate fairies in biology to explain, let's say, unobservable phenomena. One of those reasons is, well, it just simply doesn't fit with background knowledge. Not even taking an explanation into account. It's not being postulated in other neighboring fields. It's not being postulated in metaphysics or ontology. It's not being postulated in theoretical physics. But what are being postulated in these other areas are atoms or particles or fundamental particles. And so particle as a type is being invoked. And it doesn't really matter what the tokens are when it comes to background knowledge. All it matters is if the type is being invoked in other neighboring fields. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is important because it's often been said by other atheist philosophers such as Hume, Sobel, and Mackey that, well, theism just does not fit with background knowledge. Like, if you're positing God as a disembodied mind or a bodiless spirit, all we observe is minds connected to bodies. We don't observe bodiless spirits. And whenever we are invoking a personal explanation or an explanation that has to do with consciousness, it's always connected to some kind of body, either in other vertebrate life, not in invertebrate life, it doesn't matter. They're always connected to bodies. And so the idea here is that it doesn't really track well with our experience, and it's not really being postulated in other fields of inquiry. And so thus, God actually doesn't fit with background knowledge. And so therefore, on a comparative analysis, God is going to actually initially be less probable. Well, thanks to the work of Joshua Shijiwadi in his two new papers that he wrote in 2021, he wrote a paper on grounding the existence of God, and the other one was like fundamentality and explanation and the existence of God. I forget the really, really long one. But he actually finds a way for us to salvage background knowledge by not viewing God as a bodiless spirit or a disembodied mind, but rather we can view God as a trope as defined in trope theory. And if we view God as a trope, then tropes actually allows us to maintain background knowledge. We don't actually have to reduce it to anything else. We actually can keep the criterion of background knowledge. And I think it's actually rational that we ought to want to keep it when we can, because we do that with other explanations. And so if God fits with background knowledge by being a trope, what that means is that tropes are actually being invoked in other fields of inquiry. And so contemporary metaphysicians and ontologists are actually finding tropes to actually be a very advantageous way to look at things. They can do everything universals can without the baggage of universals, and so they actually allow us to do a lot of the work that we've always been wanting to do without actually tacking on certain other commitments. And so there's a lot of advantageous reasons to adopt tropes. And so there's actually a whole book called like the Ontology of Quantum Field Theory, and there's 4 chapters in that book dedicated to trope ontology and actually having a trope ontology view of quantum field theory. And so tropes are being invoked left and right within philosophy and other neighboring fields of inquiry as explanations. And so if God is a trope, remember the type, trope, God would be a token of a trope. There are different other kinds of tropes. And so it doesn't really matter what the tokens are. Like I said, it matters what the type is. And so if the type trope fits with background knowledge, then God satisfies that fitting with background knowledge. And so the idea here is that God would then be defined as an omnipotence module trope being a trope that is self-exemplifying. It instantiates itself as a property. It doesn't really have properties. Rather, it is numerically identical to the properties that it has. And so you can see the double arrow there, the biconditional arrow there, that God defined as a trope and an omnipotence module trope is God. Then that actually allows us to actually get everything we want when it comes to a robust view of theism. We can have all of the characteristics of God fit and satisfy very well trope theoretic constraints. So it does fit very well with background knowledge. You can go to the next slide.
Real quick, I just wanted to quickly mention that I've had Dr. Joshua Sijiwadi on the show to talk about this. So if you'd like to search for Joshua Sijiwadi, Capturing Christianity, you can find, I think we've done at least 2 or 3 shows with him where he explains this whole theory and how it all works. And when we're talking about a module trope, it's not some like imaginary abstract object. It's actually a concrete object. So it's not, someone in the live chat was saying, congrats, you worship a trope. But yeah, that's just to misunderstand like how this is being used here.
Yeah, there are debates within trope theory of whether or not you take a nominalist approach to trope theory. So it's just in name only, or there's an ontologically robust kind of view of trope theory. Either way, it is consistent with theism. Viewing God as a trope fits with those ideas, and so that's just what that means.
All right.
Okay, so we can call this trope theoretic theism, and what this does is it readily gives us our theoretical content, because when it comes to any theory doing any explaining, we're starting with the theoretical content. We're starting with the propositions that it takes to actually get our theory off the ground. It takes to describe our theory, and that's ultimately what's going to give us our predictions. And so our theoretical content is there exists a single metaphysically simple omnipotence module trope. And like Cameron pointed out earlier, module tropes, unlike modifier tropes, are abstract particular natures that actually instantiate their properties in objects, right? And so objects intrinsically are bestowed these trope features, right? And so often trope theorists are bundle theorists, meaning that if you take a powers view of ontology, which we will be assuming for this presentation, then substances, like Aristotelian substances, are actually bundles of tropes, because these tropes are supposed to be these irreducible, simple entities that, because a trope doesn't exhaust its content, that when you bundle these tropes together, you're actually able to get a substance, and those tropes taken together unify in such a way that it bestows the powers and the properties that that object actually has, right? So if I take a brown chair, for example, we could say, oh, that chair has a brown trope, but that trope doesn't exhaust the content of the chair. You still have things like weight and mass and things of that sort that it would take to, when bundled together, you get the chair. And so God would not be any kind of bundle. God would simply be irreducible, and so therefore would be metaphysically simple. You get non-compositeness, and you'd have attributes identical to God and to others. And so you're wondering, oh, it seems like I'm just kind of shoehorning in divine simplicity. Well, actually, trope theory, which is a really interesting consequence of trope theory, is that it's actually able to bypass Leibniz's law of indiscernibles, and it's actually able to you're actually able to have duplicates of tropes contained in the content of a single object, which is really interesting, because then it allows us to have a very analytically, metaphysically robust view of the Trinity, right? And so Sijuati actually has a paper on this as well. And if you want to see a trope theoretic approach and an aspectivalist approach to trope theory, when it comes, to divine simplicity, Joshua Sijuati has written a full paper on that, and it is what actually convinced me that a moderate view, not very radical view of divine simplicity actually is true. And so it gives us that. The reason why the properties of God here, not taken in the analogous sense, not taken in numerically distinct sense, would be numerically identical to one another, is because we're able to bypass Leibniz's law of indiscernibles. What we're able to have is we're able to think about these things in terms of what Donald Baxter calls aspects, that these are intrinsic self-different, qualitatively self-differing aspects of an object, right? So we say that you have omnipotence, but an aspect of omnipotence would be perfect goodness. And what that would mean is that it's omnipotence insofar as the power to do a best action where there is one, or many good actions where there are one, right? Or it is omnipotent insofar as the power to know all true propositions and believing no false propositions, right? And you can do that for all of the traditional attributes and characteristics of God that's been described. But these things don't have to be ontologically, numerically distinct properties. Rather, these are aspects of one single numerically identical property, which is God is his omnipotence. God doesn't have omnipotence. God is omnipotence. If God is omnipotence, then God is just goodness, because an aspect of omnipotence is goodness. It's a qualitative self-differing. It's not invoking a proper part. And so the parthood relation here is actually in terms of improper parthood, not proper parthood, because it's qualitative self-differing, not numerical self-differing. So like I said, that's as much as I want to say on that. You can read the paper defending that view. And so God is a powerful module trope. A particular object has a single character grounding the character of its bearer and is powerful, power without limit. So we're saying, what kind of limit is the power? Does the power have? We're saying 0. So God, if he exists, is a fundamental entity through his metaphysical simplicity and omnipotence. Because God is metaphysically simple omnipotence trope, God is not the output of a grounding relation. God is not reducible to any other kinds of relations or relations of causation. There's nothing that needs to explain the bundling or coming together of God's nature. And then God exists in a very anti-fragile way due to his omnipotence. And so you get right to independence, and you kind of get a backdoor entrance into metaphysical necessity as well. So this is the explanation and elucidation of the theoretical content that we're using. And so this gives God a rich form of consciousness. gives him knowledge and all these different things just from simply omnipotence. And so we also have a very simple explanation to start out with as well. So you can go to the next slide.
Real quick, so I'm seeing some people in the live chat saying that they're just having a really difficult time following today, and I'm just going to address that really quickly. So this, I said at the very beginning of this stream that this is going to be a very challenging episode. So we're not going to like back up and slow down and recap and do all these things that we might normally do in other contexts. The point of this stream is to get through this presentation as best that we can, what they have for us today. And what you can do is maybe you can rewind and you can watch it again. But sometimes it is, again, it's important to go deep. And if we just stop and have to explain over and over and over, like I'm kind of doing now, then it's just going to mess with the flow of everything. So we're just going to continue moving on, and we'll get through the whole thing. If you have questions or comments, then leave them in the comments below, and maybe Kyle and Tim can shed some more light on different things. But and this also doesn't have to be the last time that we have them on. We could also do other shows with them and stuff. So anyways, we'll get back to the presentation now. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So moving on to narrative approach to probability. Now, this is actually incredibly relevant because we're treating theism as a hypothesis. We're treating theism how we would if it were a true theory like we were to entertain in science. And so we're treating theism as a hypothesis in a way that's relevantly similar to a scientific hypothesis. Now, I'm gonna couch on that for a second because I don't want people to accuse me of claims that, let's say, more radical creationists would make. That we're trying to say that theism is exactly that of science, and so therefore we should teach God's existence as having the same merit as like particle physics or something like that, and therefore we should teach it in schools. I'm not at all saying that. I'm saying that it's relevantly similar to a scientific hypothesis. And the idea here, it goes right into how I define theory. And so this is actually taken from Trent Doherty in his book on the problem of animal pain, where he actually lays a very foundational and methodologically rigorous groundwork for how he's approaching the issue. And he defines theory in this way, in this narrative approach, which is simply a theory is a narrative which attempts to tell a coherent and compelling story about the relevant data in such a way as to portray its probable truth. If that's how we're defining theory, then theism absolutely fits that definition of theory. There's nothing exclusively scientific about this understanding of theory. This is how theories in history work, theories in literature work, theories in crime solving and medical diagnosis work. And for example, if you look at universal common descent, what is universal common descent doing? It's telling a very large holistic story about the entire history of life. And it's weaving many strands of inquiry into one coherent whole. You're having to talk about paleontology, paleobiology. You're having to go with genomics. You're having to look into genetics. You're having to look into phylogeny. You're having to take all of these separate fields of inquiry, and you're having to put things together and tell this coherent story about the history of life. And so, in a sense, it's analogous to a narrative. And so this is actually going to really help because the way in which theism can explain things and the way in which theories explain things is if we can come up when we are against the scene of our observations and tell a story about why we observe what we observe that's consonant and plausible on our theory, we're doing exactly what evolutionary biologists do when they find new data in evolution that doesn't seem readily consistent with maybe some earlier proposed explanations, but it is consistent with the base theoretical content of descent with modification. And so what I'm actually saying is that if you do think that evolution is really good science, as I do think evolution is, then this is exactly why you should actually take this narrative approach to probability, because that's what evolutionary biologists are doing all the time when it comes to these grander theories of biology. So that's it for that slide.
I think that was yours.
Okay.
I'm the next one after that. So
perfect. No, that's fine. Okay, yeah. So this part is actually really important, which we need to talk about. Well, the kind of case that we're putting together is an abductive probabilistic case, which means our view is going to have to actually make predictions when we're explaining things. Well, what we mean by prediction in this is we're actually talking about retrodiction, and we're actually talking about being able to update our priors. What does that mean? Well, in science, there's something called retroductive inference, which is instead of being able to a priori predict or antecedently predict data, we are actually able to not predict things in the future, such as we've all heard, the old Tom Jump novel testable predictions idea, right? Well, actually, if you look in science, science actually commonly proceeds through what we call retrodiction, whereas you start off with some theoretical content, and then you come to the scene of your observations. And then what you're able to do is, instead of having to make predictions actually in the future, you're actually able to provide a sufficient explanation that is consonant and plausible on the theory in which you are using and you're imposing on the data to explain what you're doing. And so what we're doing is we're doing something that is commonplace within science. And so if you want to say that, well, for data to confirm a theory, which means it just has to support it to some degree, going back to our positive relevance kind of understanding and degree of support interpretation of epistemic probability, if some evidence E supports some hypothesis H, it confirms hypothesis H. But to say that evidence E, that hypothesis can only be confirmed if it made predictions about the future before we ever found them, we have to find them later on. Well, that view is actually called predictivism. And predictivism is a very specific philosophical view of prediction. And so Swinburne actually has an appendix in his book, The Epistemic Justification, where he actually critiques predictivism. And so if you read Swinburne's work, what Swinburne's doing is he's retrodicting. He's looking at the data and he's explaining it in an abductive way. And so what this diagram illustrates is that you start off with the content of our theory, and then what your theory does is it explains the phenomena that was meant to be explained when the theory was formed. And then what we're able to do is we're actually able to take that phenomena, what we understand about it, and we're actually able to update by abduction. And we're actually able to take our prior information, our prior knowledge about the content of our theory, and we're actually able to use that to update and renormalize on our theory so that it can actually make the relevant predictions about the hypothesis. Again, this is what evolutionary biology does all the time. I have an example. For example, Darwin's finches. We wanted to know, well, what is the diversity of the beak morphology that we observe on the Galapagos Islands and the diversity of the different finches? And there were postulated explanations, mutation and things of that sort. Well, actually, contemporary evidence actually tells us that actually wasn't a mutation. It wasn't an altering of the genetic code itself. It was actually an altering of gene expression. It was an epigenetic modification, and the adaptation was passed down through epigenetic inheritance. And so what it did is we were actually able to learn about epigenetics and its role in evolutionary structures and the altering of evolutionary structures as such. But that doesn't decrease the probability of evolution. What it allows us to do is, through abduction, it allows us to update our prior information about what we think evolution actually has us to predict. We are still observing descent with modification, but the mechanisms of such, we had the wrong idea in the beginning about how the mechanisms worked. And now we're able to update the content of our theory based on that. And so this is how retrodiction works. This is how the updating of our priors works. And this is exactly how we're going to be using a theistic explanation. And so I hope that you guys listening are able to catch a common theme here. We are trying to frame theism in terms of a theory in a way that's very similar to how science works. We're trying to use the logic of science and apply it to theism. So we're using these foundational principles in the same way that you would use them in science on theism. And that's exactly why we bring up retrodiction here. And that's how exactly when I talk about predicting, I'm talking about retrodicting. I'm not talking about making future predictions. I'm talking about making explanations when we come to the scene of the data. And that's it for that one.
Yeah. So what Tim was saying, so now that we have epistemic probability covered, now that we have retrodiction covered, now that we understand that God is consistent with background knowledge, now we have to get into, okay, well, what is that? That doesn't really tell us anything about what theism is actually going to predict or retrodict, or how does theism explain things? Well, there's actually 3 principles that we want to propose here. So the first one is what's called the diffusiveness principle. So this principle basically just says that goodness is necessarily diffusive of itself. So this is a principle that Sijuwati himself uses in 2 of his papers. And so the basic idea behind the diffusiveness principle is that God has to do something. So just by the very fact that God is all good, he kind of has to, by his nature, do some kind of action, right? And it's just going to be an inevitable consequence of God's nature that he does an action, right? It's just by the nature of goodness itself that God is going to do something. Now, it's questionable what God will bring about, so that's still a further question. But the basic idea behind the diffusiveness principle is that because goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself, then goodness, in this case God, would inevitably bring about other good things, right? So that's all that the diffusiveness principle is stating. So now we get into the second principle, which is the plenitude principle. So Sujwadi says, quote, God brings things into existence in order to communicate his goodness to creatures and to represent his goodness through them. And since his goodness cannot be adequately represented by any one creature, he produced many diverse creatures, so that what was lacking in one's representation of the divine goodness may be supplied by another. For the goodness that exists in a simple and unified way in God exists in multiple and divided ways among creatures. Hence, the universe as a whole participates and represents God's goodness in a more perfect way than any one creature does. So I guess the idea, we could say is the idea behind the plenitude principle is that in any world that God creates, there's going to have to be a plenitude of things or a diversity of good things. So there can't just be a world where, let's say, it's just me, Cameron, and Tim. Like, that's not enough. That God actually by his nature is going to have to create a multiplicity of good things other than, let's say, moral agents or something like that. And we'll get into that later in the presentation, what those might look like. But I guess the idea behind the diffusivity principle is that God has to do something. He has to create a world. Again, it's not saying anything about what God has to create, right? Just rather that God has to bring about good things. And then the plenitude principle would further restrict that by saying that whatever God brings about, there has to be a multiplicity or a diversity of good things. Again, we're going to get more into what that might be later, but that's sort of the core idea behind these two principles. And I would say that these principles are actually just entailed from the goodness of God. So next slide. So the final principle is what I call the ultimate goodness principle. And this is what it says. So for any S, state of affairs, S can be instantiated by God if at some time T, S bears the axiological status of being good on the whole. Now, I want to sort of stop there and think, what do we mean by good on the whole? Well, think of it like this. So it's actually pretty relevant, I would say, for the problem of evil, because what people will often say is that, well, God can't create like an imperfect world. Like God had to start off with a perfect world, right? But actually this principle says no, that all that God has to create is that at some time, so any world that God creates at some time must that world bear the axiological status of being good on the whole. And so one way you can think about this is if God creates a world that is, let's say, initially imperfect, or let's say that this world needs to develop, right? As long as that world reaches the status of being good on the whole, then it's not really an issue for God's goodness, right? Because what God is looking at, he's looking at the full timeline of a world rather than any specific, point in that world. And this is, I think, relevant for, I don't want to get too much in the arguments from evil here, but one sort of consequence of this, the UGBT principle, is that for any world that God creates, that if there is evil in that world, then that evil must be defeated, basically. That the evil that a creature experiences, that creature must come to embrace that suffering at some time, that they can recognize the suffering that they went through. And so you could say that a defeat of evil is itself is when a creature reaches a status of reaching being good on the whole, right? So they recognize the evil that they went through, and then they fully embrace that suffering in a way where they can recognize how the suffering that they went through actually contributed to their identity, contributed to them being good on the whole. So I just want to throw that out there because some people might say, Kyle, don't you have to conditionalize on evil for this principle? Well, no. So the ultimate goodness principle, it doesn't conditionalize on evil. All it's saying is that God has to create a world that at some time reaches the axiological status being good in the whole. And what the defeat principle would say is that any evil or any imperfection that some creature goes through, that it must defeat that evil, right? So the defeat principle is conditional upon evil, whereas this principle is more antecedent. So it's more sort of constraining what God from his goodness is going to bring about. You can go to next slide. So now, well, Tim, if you want to.
Yeah, exactly. This is slide 17, so I'll take this one. Yeah, so this is more modeling and continuing on with modeling the theistic evidence. This is called the Axiological Relevance Thesis, ART henceforth. And what this says is that for any observation O, theism predicts O if and only if a relation of axiological relevance connects propositions about theism to propositions about O. Now, what does this mean and why the heck is this even relevant? Well, this is actually relevant because I actually was inspired to come up with this thesis and really this condition from, again, Nevin Kleimenhagen's work. He wrote a paper called Explanation Guides Confirmation. Confirmation being the degree the degree in which some data supports a hypothesis, right? So to any degree some data supports a hypothesis, it's considered a confirmation, right? Well, if we're going to be looking at theism predicting evidence, we're talking about confirmation. But an issue with that is what's guiding our notion of confirmation? How do we know that a certain observation actually is likely on theism? I sometimes commonly see people fine-tuning proponents. They'll say, well, they'll just take the likelihood. They won't do the full odds form Bayesian analysis. They'll just take a likelihoodist approach, and they'll say, well, the likelihood of observing a life-permitting universe on theism is greater than its negation. And it's like, well, why is that? And usually they'll posit an intention like, oh, because God wants a life-permitting universe. For me, that's not satisfactory because God is capable of a multiplicity of intentions, right? That doesn't really get to the bottom, right? Another theist could say something different about why God wanted a life-permitting universe. Maybe it's because a life-permitting universe resembles the nature of God more than something else, and that's fine. But I think that what we need to have, and the attitude here, is we need to have something guiding our theistic confirmation. And what I think that certain theistic arguments have a problem with is that they focus on the wrong aspect of God's nature to make these certain predictions, right? And so if we want to make these predictions in our abductive case that we're doing, we have to know what relation between our observations and God is actually obtaining. And I call it a relation of axiological relevance. So what we're able to do is we're able to take God's characteristics. So God is numerically identical to his goodness. So God is goodness. And we're able to map the characteristics of God, his goodness, to value propositions of our observations, right? So let's say that we observe some states of affairs, and there's something actually even intrinsically valuable about those states of affairs. But what we're able to do is we have a one-to-one mapping. We're able to take God's goodness, and we're able to map onto goodness from good states of affairs in God to good states of affairs in the world. And so we're able to do this thing called theoretical property mapping. We're actually able to map God to the world from goodness to goodness. And that makes sense. It's like the truth of P, if P implies Q, then the truth of P will be preserved over Q. Well, the truth of whatever God makes from his nature, if he's going to diffuse his goodness, if goodness is where everything's coming from, then we should expect to find this value connection. It's this connection of axiological relevance. And so the idea here is that we're going to say the likelihood of O given T really just is the likelihood of O given T and E being the axiological relevance thesis. And so the idea here is that it will always be more likely that some observation will always be more likely on theism when we're able to take into account the axiological relevance of the observation versus if we aren't taking that into account. And that's what the second probability function on the bottom there is, the comparative statement is trying to say. That if we exclude the axiological relevance thesis, we're kind of arbitrarily kind of saying why we think the likelihood of some observation is high on theism versus not. But this gives us a clear guide to theistic confirmation. And that's the condition that we're working with, which is Are we able to find any valuable feature of the world? Okay, boom. If we're able to find that, we're able to extract that and identify that, then we are able to map that and route that to fundamental reality. If fundamental reality is good, you should find good things. We found good things. We can map that back to fundamental reality being good. And that's how that works. And that's what this thesis exactly is giving us. It's giving us a guide for doing that. So you can go to the next slide.
Do you want me to do this one or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So basically, this is sort of, now that we understand the axiological relevance thesis, now that we understand sort of the principles of value, so the diffusiveness principle, the plenitude principle, and the ultimate goodness principle. So now we get into the more specifically about how does, what is the evidence for theism and how can we map it? So let E be some value state. Let E star be some disvalue state. Let T be theism, and let not T be, of course, the negation of theism. So of course, this is the odd form of Bayes' theorem, but it's basically just sort of laying out, I guess, the framework that any value state is automatically evidence for theism, whereas some disvalue state is evidence against theism, right? So it's evidence for the negation of theism. So this is sort of in Bayes' form how we're sort of like formally presenting it. Next slide. So now we're going to get into, did you want to do this part, Tim, or did you want me to go over the evidence? Or
I have no, this is my part.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So so we're now going to get to the part that probably everybody else is wanting to get into, which is the evidence for theism. But we still have to go over how we're actually going to model this evidence. And so this part right here, if you're going to listen very carefully, it's going to be this part right here. And so what we're saying in this slide is that all theistic evidence can actually, because we're coming from a standpoint and a framework of axiology, we're always going back to goodness. We're always going back to value. Things are always explained in terms of value. That's how we make our predictions. Then I think that we can actually propose a 3-category taxonomy for taxonomizing theistic evidence. How we're able to do that is, it's commonly said by those who believe in a benevolent foundational reality that there is the true, the good, and the beautiful. This saying goes back to ancient philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers, that either you view God as the absolute, the all abundance, or traditional monotheistic versions of theism. It's this idea that God is the purest concentration of all qualities, and these qualities, if we're able to pull them out in kind of a branching structure, we're able to actually identify them as you have beauty, you have goodness, and then you have truth. And that's all summed and summed up by who God is. So if our explanation is in terms of value, then we should be able to look at the states of affairs of the world, and we should be able to group them into this 3-category taxonomy. So you have 3 domains: the moral domain, the alethic domain, and the aesthetic domain. And so if you look at the diagram on the right, you start from a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. Through a relation of axiology, branches out into these 3 different domains: morals, truth, and beauty, right? And so this can actually be derived independently from the plenitude principle, that it must be a variety of goods that each represent an aspect of God's goodness, right? An aspect of God's goodness is that he is truth. The aspect of God's goodness is that he is good. The aspect of God's goodness is that he is beautiful, right? And this is something that all really Christian monotheists, Western and Eastern, have all agreed upon, whether or not you take more of a mystical approach or not, that this is what God is. And so it's unsurprising that if we look into the world, that we're able to observe morals, we're able to observe aesthetics, we're able to observe truth, right? And so whatever you look at into the world and you go, does this observation support the hypothesis of theism? Well, you can ask yourself, well, are we able to group that? Are we able to label that in some axiological domain? Does it relate to morality? Does it relate to truth? Does it relate to beauty, right? So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is then where we're going to get our predictive power from. And so right here, these are just some data that we can some toy data that we're playing around with, right? This is our model, and we're gonna and you can see how we can put these into different categories, right? So the moral domain, what do we observe? We observe moral agents. We observe that there's moral knowledge, there's moral awareness, and we observe that there's saint making, meaning that there are the highest manifestations of agape love. That there have been a multiplicity of people that have existed in this world that have made themselves into such great and exemplifying character, like that of Jesus Christ, like that of some of the greatest spiritual teachers in this world. Well, that's going to make a lot of sense. That's going to fit into the moral domain. So you have those different things. You have the alethic domain relating to truth, right? There are mathematical truths that are readily be able to be discovered. There are logical truths that are readily able to be discovered. And there's scientific discoverability, the whole rational enterprise of science, right? Explanations in general relate to the alethic domain. And they have the aesthetic domain, right? We have an orderly, complex universe. It's vast. It's beautiful. It's if you look at its scale, if you look at all the different varieties and uniqueness of objects and states of affairs that obtain in the universe, it's very analogous to something that we would want to see in a great painting. And I actually think that the aesthetic impulse comes from what we observe in the vastness of the universe, right? In the vastness of a dark night or things of that sort. And so we have an orderly, complex universe that fits into that. We have universal beauty that every conscious agent in some way experiences the awes and wonders of aesthetics. And then we have just the general aesthetic impulse that's present in all cultures at all times. And so these things, you have the moral, you have the alethic, and you have the aesthetic domain able to color our reality completely. So you go to the next slide. So we can start off with the moral domain, right? So for example, here's a toy datum, right? We can say, well, the story here is that a sufficient number of human beings throughout human existence have exemplified high degrees of saintliness / moral making, and the realization of the highest manifestations of agape love and higher states of consciousness. And so we're able to kind of tease out and really epistemically discover what these things mean. Higher states of consciousness and agape love, in an ongoing striving over our own primitive states. So that's moral development. That's a development beyond our simple biology, which is a striving towards virtue, because virtues have to be hard won. So now we have a virtue-based axiology, right? It allows us to gain moral knowledge and understanding of moral concepts, right? And so this fits directly well within the moral domain. Even things like psychophysical harmony fits in that, right? Because you have to have these right connections to be able to actually apprehend these moral concepts and things like that sort. So you could actually even include that. Arguments from consciousness, because consciousness is a precondition for this. They all fit into these categories. So you can go to the next one. And so the alethic domain, well, what's a part of the alethic datum? Well, in the alethic datum, there are a vast number of mathematical, logical, and scientific truths that we are able to discover via the scientific method or the philosophical method. For a long time, science was really talked about as natural philosophy. This was, the beginnings of Aristotle's work and kind of being a kind of an empirical scientist of his own, applying the rationalists' kind of understanding and truths about the world into observations, right? And so humans are actually able to have this ability to discern truths about the world. We're actually able to apprehend and actually gain knowledge. And so we can explain the applicability of mathematics and logic within the realm of reason, right? But the realm of reason is the alethic domain. And so this fits in our taxonomized understanding of our axiological domains. And it makes sense of reality that is fundamentally rational rather than irrational, right? And so if reality is fundamentally rational, relating to truth, then we should observe truth. And so ontological arguments can fit into this. We think ontological arguments actually, I think, can fit into just all axiological domains, because what we're talking about is not only are we having to really analytically and rigorously discover different ideas about modality and things of that sort, but we're also talking about all perfections, maximal goodness, maximal greatness, the greatest concentration of positive properties, things of that sort. So I think ontological arguments really just spans the entire gambit, and et cetera and so forth. So you can go to the next one. And then you have the aesthetic domain. The universe is orderly and it runs by gnomic laws, right? The universe is also vast, and the world as a whole is sufficiently large amount of aesthetic beauty and wonder. Human beings have always recognized that there is an aesthetic impulse that we have in us to look at the universe this way. And the universe is very holistic in how it functions, its patterns, and its uniqueness and its representations of such actually do fit into different normative theories of aesthetics. I think you have I forget what the theories are exactly called, but I think
We don't need to get into that, Tim.
No, it's fine. I'm not going to, but I'm saying that
Yeah.
if somebody's worried about whether or not this is exclusively fits only in one way of viewing aesthetics, actually works with all of them. So it's actually consistent across the
Yeah.
board. Aesthetics are consistent across the board. And so, for example, we can view our fine-tuned cosmos as evidence for an orderly world. An orderly world fits in the aesthetic domain. The vastness of the universe speaks to aesthetics, as well as the universe evolving over time. It's very narratival in a sense that you're able to see how a painting is able to integrate all of its disparate parts into a unified whole, and it kind of tells a story on its own. And the universe is kind of that process of awakening. This kind of also goes back to theologian John Hout's understanding of the universe as a process of awakening, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which you can relate this to the datum of aesthetics. And so contingency, nomological arguments, cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, arguments from beauty would all fit in this category. So that's it for that one. And so basically then we can kind of have a comparative analysis. Recall that we are using the odds form Bayes theorem, which is that it's the prior odds times likelihood ratio is what's going to give you your posterior odds. What that basically means is this is just another way to view Bayes theorem. And I think that it's a really helpful way, especially if we're doing a very basic comparative analysis, that if we're assuming that, let's say, the priors of theism and its competitors are all equal, then if we multiply that by the likelihood ratio, all of our evidence, so for example, we're just entertaining that there's 5 different bits of evidence. Then if we compare that, then the more top heavy the odds, the better the theistic explanation. And so a theistic explanation will do better and be more probable if it has higher odds than its than what's in the denominator. Numerator is higher than its denominator. And so what matters in this sense is total probability relevant to total evidence of the explanations. This is the heart of a cumulative case. This is the heart of looking at things in its totality. And this is what a lot of atheologians also prefer to do. This is what Swinburne does as a theistic philosopher, but this is what other atheologians such as Paul Draper like to do, that we have to view things in its totality in a more holistic way. And the odds form Bayes theorem allows us to really systematically formulate these things. And I think that that's very relevant to how we're going to approach, or how one can approach, arguing for theism and modeling theistic evidence. So that's it for that one. All right, Kyle, it's you.
All right. No, yeah. So before we can go back, I just want to clarify something. So, before we go into objections, I just want people to understand that we're not saying that the piece of evidence that we presented necessarily have to be persuasive, but rather we're given a framework for how cumulative cases for theism can work, right? So it's not like we're presenting something new. So if you're a theist and you think some of the arguments we used didn't work, that's fine. But if you have some other arguments, then it probably would fit into that, right? I hope, Cameron, do you understand? I just want to make sure that you understand, Cameron, what we're trying to do here, because I feel like a lot of people think that we're making the new cumulative case, and it's no, what we're doing is we're seeing how a theist can make a cumulative case, so we can take the evidence we have, incorporate it into the framework.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as mainly you guys just building, like you said, a framework, and that's the title. The whole presentation is just a framework for understanding how these different pieces of data fit in, how it all works probabilistically, and giving a background, for God as an omnipotence trope and all these different things. It really is just sort of framing out the whole issue. And this is because you guys haven't discussed what actually does fit into the denominator here, for example. So you're not giving a posterior probability of, the Bayes, the posterior, you're not calculating the posterior probability here because you haven't calculated what goes in the denominator. And so this is not you're not giving an argument for theism. You're not saying that this is obviously theism is the most probable worldview. You're just saying this is a kind of a really good way of going about actually doing the calculation.
Right. Yeah. And so that's basically the idea. And I think it's also helpful for the atheist as well, because if theism doesn't predict disvalued states, then evidence for atheism in this case is actually going to be disvalued states. So they can sort of reverse the argument and show why theism is unsuccessful, right? So I think it works. I think both sides it's going to be helpful for both sides of the debate, especially given. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, you finish your thought.
No, one last thing I was going to say is like there's a philosopher Graham Oppie, so he makes a point how you have just a bunch of these arguments, and what people ignore is that typically you can reject one of the premises in those arguments given the fact that let's say Oppie holds to some specific view about modality or something, then he can object to like contingency arguments or any kind of other arguments. So this is sort of a way to frame it where basically it's just a cumulative argument. So cumulative arguments in that case, it's a multiplicity of data, and so it's going to be more difficult for an atheist just to reject one or two arguments. So,
well, what I was going to tag on is that I like how you're framing things in terms of like value versus disvalue, and so something that's going to confirm atheism over theism would be a disvalue state, and the typical states of affairs or arguments that people appeal to is like the problem of evil, divine hiddenness. These seem like states of affairs that are disvaluable. So yep. I like the way of framing it in that way, because I mean, ultimately I think there's a whole lot more value states than there are disvalue states. So that's part of the reason why I'm a theist. But I like the point of this is how to frame it. And I like this framing. So.
Yep. All right, let's go to the objections now. So there are 5, you can go to the next slide. So there are 5 main objections we want to address in the presentation. There might be some others out there, but these, at least in the research that me and Tim have done throughout these past few years, these are kind of the 5 objections that we found to be the most powerful objections. So the first one is theism can't explain anything because of God's omnipotence. So let's go to there. So this is typically an objection you'll hear from people. I'm not going to name any names, but I've heard a lot of people say, well, if God is omnipotent, then God can do anything. And if God can do anything, then he has infinite ways of doing things. And so therefore we can't say that God would do one thing over another. And so basically theism has no explanatory power. It can't explain anything, right? Because God has an infinite degrees of freedom, right? So there are 3 critical problems with this objection. So the first one is just pretty obvious, that it ignores the fact that God is motivated by his goodness, right? So God is not motivated by his powers or abilities, but rather theism makes its predictions off of his goodness rather than his omnipotence, right? And if you view God in terms of a trope, well, that's also going to sort of bypass the issue, because God's omnipotence is going to be identically related to his goodness. So God is goodness. So therefore God's going to act by goodness. It's just sort of not entailed, but there's an identity relation between them, right? So we could still model and on the next slide we have a sort of diagram for this, but yeah, that's sort of the first problem with the objection. But the second problem is for the objection is that it actually so there's a thought experiment. I'm not going to mention any names that we got from a philosopher, and this is what sort of he told us. So it ignores that even if you have infinite possibilities, you can still put an epistemic probability that is non-zero. So let's say that you're throwing a dart with a point size tip at an Euclidean dartboard. So let's say that this dartboard is infinitely big, okay? And let's say that some laser is going to guide to some part of that dartboard, right? But let's also say that because it's infinitely big, that the probability or the mathematical probability of you hitting any particular point of that dartboard is 0. Okay. Well, even if that's true, which I would say it's still guaranteed that it's still going to hit the board. So even if you have a board that's infinitely big, and even if you have a probability of 0 that it's going to hit any particular point of that board, it's still going to be, at least epistemically, non-zero that you are going to hit some point of that board. Right. So it's just simply false to say that, oh, well, you have a probability or a mathematical probability of 0 because God has infinite ways of doing things. Well, that's actually not true once you sort of lay out the thought experiment here, because it's guaranteed that you're going to hit the dartboard, even if we don't know exactly where we're going to hit it. And then finally, the third objection, or at least the third response to the objection, is that it ignores equivalent classes and finite partitions, and of course the ability of God to choose among infinite tokens among finite types. So when we're talking about theistic what God chooses, we're not talking about a token world, but rather we're talking about a type of world. So if you have type A, which says that God creates, type B, God doesn't create, well, given the diffusiveness principle, God is always going to choose A, even if there's an infinite number of ways that he could choose A. And you could further, reduce it down. So I guess the important thing here is when we're talking about God's choices, we're not talking about the tokened world. Rather, we're talking about the type of world that God creates. And this sort of relates back to Trent Dowdery's work on his neo-Leibnizian, I think is, Tim, is it the neo?
It's the
Leibnizian?
quasi-Leibnizian
Okay, quasi. I thought it
Protestant,
was
which
neo.
is the
Okay,
which
yeah,
is God chooses a subset of the best possible kind of world. So a random subset of the best possible kind of world, and that can be left up to chance, and there can be an
right.
infinite
And
number of
so
ways.
the important thing to understand here is, given our prior principles, there's a probability of 1 that God will create a best kind of world, right? And so talking about the token of that world, like we're in a token of the type, right? And there could be an infinite number of tokens, but it doesn't matter if there's an infinite number of tokens, but because what we're talking about is a type of world rather than a token world. You understand what I'm saying? I just want to make sure people understand what I'm saying here. Cameron.
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So next slide. So this is sort of a diagram that Tim put together, and this is sort of showing at least what's called the theoretical constraints of theism. So if you notice on the left slide, we have the total axiological space. And let's say, going back to the dartboard example, where let's say I close my eyes and I have an infinite dartboard. Okay, but imagine this dartboard is referencing value. Well, let's say I close my eyes, throw it, it's going to hit some part of the dartboard, right? So there's still going to be a non-zero probability that it's going to hit some part of the dartboard. And then on the right side of the right diagram, God is never going to go outside that circle. So God is never going to go outside the range of value. So any world that God creates has to be within the best kind of world, or the best token or type of world. It can't go outside of that, right? So this shows at least that the objection doesn't work. That basically the objection that, oh, well, we can't predict theism can't explain anything because God is omnipotent. Well, that's just false, because obviously God is going to be constrained by value. And if God is constrained by value, then that automatically puts constraints on what he's going to do. So therefore, the objection that, well, God can't explain anything, it just doesn't work. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that. But and then the second objection is simply that if we have axiology as our background knowledge, then this decreases the prior probability of theism because it requires additional claims about value states, right? So this is an objection. I haven't really seen any philosophers make this objection, but I have seen people online make this objection. And the basic idea here is, like, don't we have to assume that there are value states? So we have to have an additional theory about value states before we can proceed to talk about what theism predicts or what theism explains. So there are 3 sort of problems, I would say, with this objection. So the first one is that it simply just assumes an orthodox view of Bayesianism. So even ignoring the other 2 problems, is that on explanationism, the intrinsic probability is not determined by the number of claims or monocia a hypothesis makes, but rather the intrinsic probability of a world is a function of how simple are the highest level hypotheses which it contains, and how well they are able to explain all the other propositions that the world contains. So on explanationism, the simplest worldview, the simplest, let's say, theory that has the less claims or is not going to be the most probable one. In fact, Nevin Klemhanga, he actually has an unpublished paper called Are Simpler Worlds More Probable? And in that paper, he kind of shows why probabilistically, just because your hypothesis has less claims does not mean that it's more probable, right? So you have to actually, if you want to show that your theory is more probable, you're going to have to filter it through the lenses of explanationism, right? So that's sort of the first issue with his objection, is that it ignores the fact that on an explanationist view of Bayesianism, you can have it where, yeah, even if it is true that we have to make some assumptions about value, that's not relevant to the probability of the hypothesis. Now, the second response I have to this objection is simply that necessary axiological truths, or the axiology we're using, is simply the principles of logic applied to axiological concepts, right? So these are just analytical truths about value. So just as an example, just as it is true to say that no bachelor is married, right? Because that's a contradiction. You can't say that. It's also true to say that I think the example that I sort of had in my, well, there's a paper by Tim Mawson, I believe, Tim, about, yeah. So it was a paper about God's creation of morality. One of the examples that he brought up in that paper was it is wrong to punish the innocent or something like that. And so that is, I would say that was an analytical truth. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to assume a kind of moral realism in order to accept that. You can just say that given this axiological concept, that when you apply the laws of logic to it, that this is kind of just an analytical truth, right? So again, you don't have to assume moral realism because it's not making any claims about stance independent axiology, but rather it's just talking about axiological truths in and of themselves. And then finally, I'd say the third problem with this objection is that it actually ignores a very important thing in the philosophy of science, which is called conformational holism. And conformational holism basically says that hypotheses typically rest on background assumptions from which to derive predictions. So in this case, the background system is a value system or an axiology, right? So if we're being consistent, so what I'm saying is background knowledge is a criteria when assessing theism, right? Then we have to take into account conformational holism. And when we take that into account, then that's also going to have to require background assumptions about what these predict. And in this case, it's going to be some kind of axiology. So I hope that clears up any objection. I hope that, these responses to the objection are satisfactory to people. But go to the next slide and Tim can take care of that one.
Perfect. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah. So the next objection that we're going to be dealing with is axiology is arbitrary or it's too subjective. So the objection goes like this. Well, you're just picking and choosing what is valuable and disvaluable. And it just so happens that we find ourselves in a world with a state of affairs that's aligning with what you think is valuable and disvaluable. And so I think this is a good objection in the sense that I kind of take a more of Josh Rasmussen's kind of attitude here, which is like, well, what will this actually help us better discover and see about what theism allows us to predict and see? And so I think this objection is actually asking a very good question. And so go back to what I was saying earlier, which we can kind of talk about as a theistic maxim, which is any feature of the world that can be identified as valuable is motivation for God to realize it. So value states have a prima facie allure to God. God is motivated to do the good. Now, what's interesting about axiology is what's helping us in our discovery of finding what is valuable and what is disvaluable. And so if we're finding a multiplicity of value, that's not because we're cherry picking our theories of value. It's because our theories of value are actually helping us discover what's valuable. Remember, we're able to update our priors, we're able to update our information by discovering things, right? So for example, let's say that you let's say that, this is actually a good example. Let's say that you see you hear that a woman is in great agony and pain and she's screaming, right? If you just have that context alone, you're saying, wow, this is very disvaluable. This is really bad. What axiology is going to justify this, right? But then if you find out that she's giving birth to her first child, in which she's been anticipating for a long time, she's been so happy to do it, then you go, oh, okay, well, I understand now. She's giving birth to a child, and subsequent to the birth, she's very happy that she finally gets to hold her first child in her arms, right? And so we're able to discover, oh, okay, well, there's actually some value states of affairs going on here. Humans have intrinsic value. And then there are other theories of axiology that correspond to the intrinsic value of human beings. And so we have to go back to our explanationist framework, which is that higher order axiological theories inform us as to what is valuable and what is not. You can't simply start with a neutral understanding. This is going against what's discussed in the philosophy of science literature called theory ladenness, that no datum exists apart from a theory, which ties into our view of arguments and very similar and adjacent to Oppie's view of arguments, which is that if we observe some evidence, then that's going to be evidence for some theory somewhere. And what axiology does is it allows us to start with this higher order directly explanatory theory. That's our axiology. And that directly impinges and is conditional upon our observations. And that's what allows us to come up with these probability assignments, right? So if the theist is within their theory can identify consonant axiological justifications for thinking X is valuable, going back to this narrative approach of theories, then they can derive predictions in a consistent way, just as we do in evolutionary biology. And so I think that this objection ultimately isn't devastating. I actually think it actually has a really good and valuable consequence. It allows us to understand in greater detail of how this whole thing is working. All right, you can go to the next one. Perfect. Okay, then we can go to the naturalistic parity. So we've talked about this just a little bit in the past here in this presentation, but this idea is that, well, naturalists are free to parody this framework so that naturalism can make the same predictions as theism. If you are unfamiliar with the philosopher Graham Oppie and his work, to anybody listening, what Graham Oppie does is he sees in his theory comparison that naturalism is actually more of a subtraction of theism, and theism is actually an addition to naturalism, right? Naturalism only posits there will be natural entities with natural causal powers, right? And theism adds extra content on top of that there are supernatural entities with supernatural causal powers, right? And so what Graham Oppie wants to do is he wants to go, okay, well, within my understanding of naturalism, within my understanding of natural, am I able to have the same access to the same resources or the same kinds of explanations while cutting off this postulation of the supernatural, right? And so one of his ideas is that, well, let's say that the fine tuning of the universe is a brute contingency or a brute necessity, but God is the source of this inexplicable reason as to why the universe is fine tuned. We can cut off God and we could just keep the inexplicability without God and still keep the our explanatory power that way. Well, these are different ways in which that can be done. So Malpass kind of has a stalking horse objection, right? Where God desires X because God is motivated by value. Where we can say, well, then there's some naturalistic initial state that just has dispositions towards value. And so now the naturalist has been able to parrot the same explanatory resources as theism. Or for example, Oppie's view of modality, right? He is able to explain necessities, right, in terms of modality that fits very well with a naturalistic worldview that doesn't involve any supernatural entities. So
quick clarification. He doesn't explain. I think you just misspoke. He doesn't explain necessities. He explains by necessities.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Did I not say that?
Yeah. You just misspoke, but it was correct on the slide.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Perfect. Thanks for that. So that's what I was trying to say. So these are different ways in which naturalists could say, hey, listen, I'm not really impressed by this theistic explanation because I can do the same thing. And even axiarchism will kind of be able to do the same thing. Axiarchism is just this view. If you're familiar with Philip Goff, he kind of has this view as well, where there is fundamental reality is normatively constrained towards the good, but it's in a brute way, which is like, it doesn't act on the basis of best possible kind of action or good actions. It just diffuses into good things. And there's really no explanation as to why or really any other kind of good thing, right? Well, the issue with this is that given the axiological relevance thesis, the naturalist actually cannot, and the axiarchist actually cannot parrot the theistic explanation. For example, on theism, we are taking this in terms of likelihoods. We're doing comparative analysis in terms of probability, what confirms and what disconfirms. And theism starts off with axiology as its explanation, but it's not even something that we have to even add in as an assumption. It's just something that is numerically identical to God. And then we can epistemically figure out what are the best actions and what are not the best actions, what are good actions versus bad actions. Where on naturalism, it is antecedently very improbable that some initial state will have some causal disposition towards these value states over here or these value states over there. And so left up to chance, it is very improbable that we would land in the best possible kind of world where theism says, from God's goodness, if there is a best possible kind of world, God will do that action. And so what the naturalists would have to do is they'd have to add complexity to their theoretical content by modifying their hypothesis to not only natural causal entities, but natural causal entities with the disposition towards the good. The theist can actually cut that off. We don't need this extra assumption about the disposition towards the good because it's actually inherent in the nature of goodness itself. And the same thing with axiarchism, that if there is a best action or a best kind of action.
Cameron. Sorry, Cameron,
Yeah.
you should probably go to the next slide because he's going in. Yeah, I don't know if
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
There you go. No, we're good. We're good. Yeah, and so if there's a best action or best kind of action, right, then it's a probability of 1 that God will do that action. But it's not a probability of 1 on axiarchism that the fundamental reality, whatever it is, will have disposition towards that action. It has dispositions towards any kind of action. But on theism, we actually have our selection pressures. We have selection pressures within our theory that we don't actually have to add complexity to actually figure out. And so this diagram really shows that here pretty well. So these other competitors, such as naturalism and such as axiarchism, they can try to parrot a theistic explanation, but given what we know about the diffusiveness principle, given what we know about the plenitude principle, and given what we know about the axiological relevance thesis, it is not actually able to parrot the theistic explanation where they're actually able to maximize explanation in the same way that the theist is actually able to maximize explanation. So you can go to the next one.
All right, so you want me to do this one? I'll do this
Sure.
one, Tim. So the second response is, of course, Oppi's view, where basically you explain by modality, necessity. But I would say that this doesn't help them at all. So consider the following scenario. Let's say that it is metaphysically necessary that you have laws. So again, say these laws are metaphysically necessary, and that these laws entail that crystals will form, which read out John 3:16. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, like John 3:16 is, let's say, laid out in like multiple languages across different cultures and so on and so forth, right? Now, of course, I would say, and think everyone here would agree, that this would be very strong evidence for Christian theism, even if it is a metaphysical necessity that you have these laws. So even if it's metaphysical necessity that you have laws of nature, which entail that you have crystals which naturally form out to read John 3:16, this would still be very strong epistemic evidence for Christian theism, even if you have some modal explanation for the data, right? So even if you explain by necessities, and even if you use modality, right, it is still going to favor the theist in this case, right? Once we fill in the evidence, right? And this applies, of course, to any evidence that is put within the framework, right? And so I guess the issue here, I guess the fundamental problem with this approach is that modality is completely irrelevant to epistemic probability. So I can grant, for the sake of argument, that yeah, the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary. It's metaphysically necessary they have conscious agents, moral agents, et cetera, right? So if you want to go down the route of explaining by modality and necessities, I can grant that, but that's not going to help you in terms of epistemic probability, right? So I would say that's the fundamental problem with this approach, is that it completely ignores the fact that we're talking about epistemic probability, not metaphysical probability or any other types of probability. And then, of course, the other issue with this parity method is that something natural is always neutral with respect to value states. And so when you take into account the axiological relevance thesis, as we went over earlier, this isn't going to help the naturalists either, because if you just say something is natural, well, that's not going to really tell you if that natural thing is going to be disposed to bring about valuable states of affairs, right? So in this case, then, no matter which way you go, explanation by necessities or explanation by modality is not going to be able to parrot any sort of theistic explanation, right? If we parse it out in terms of axiology. So next slide, Cameron. Sorry. All right. So finally, we have the Axiarchist response. So admittedly, I think that the Axiarchist is actually probably in the best boat, because what they would say is that we can explain things in terms of goodness, right? Now, of course, naturalists are not going to want to go this route, but I actually think if you want to remain a non-theist, like don't want to accept theism, this is probably the best theory you should hold to. So basically, hold to an Axiarchist position where you explain things in terms of just some kind of brute goodness rather than some sort of indifference hypothesis. So there are sort of three general objections that we have to Axiarchist views. So the first objection I would say is that Axiarchism is not a simple explanation. So it has to posit many brute items in the ontology. It leaves more unexplained, right? And of course, I would say that it's not consistent with background knowledge. I think Richard Swinburne has made this point. I forgot exactly where basically if we're just going to say that things exist because it's good for them to exist, well, that doesn't really fit well with our background knowledge about how we explain why things exist, right? So the second response that we have to the Axiarchist view is that it doesn't really tell us the types of goods that are going to come about, right? So you're not going to expect like moral agents, right? And so because of this, because you don't have the same taxonomy as the theist, right? Then it's going to be more ambiguous. So it's not going to have the same kind of explanatory power. And then finally is that Axiarchism doesn't say that we are going to live in the best kind of world, right? Or that there would be a plenitude of good things, right? So because it doesn't have those principles, right? Because Axiarchism doesn't entail that we're going to live in the best kind of world, then it's not going to really have the same kind of explanatory power of theism, because I think at least that the best kind of world is going to be a world with a plenitude of good things, right? Whereas on Axiarchism, you're not going to really expect that. So while it is true that the Axiarchist is in a better spot than the naturalist, I think ultimately at the end of the day, theism is still going to win against the Axiarchist. So now next slide. So finally, we are at the understated evidence objection. And I would say out of all the objections, this is probably the best one. So, and me and Tim are going to be both responding to this objection because I think it needs to be addressed thoroughly. So the fallacy of understated evidence says this: you identify some general fact F about a topic X that is antecedently more likely on theism than naturalism. But then you ignore more specific facts about X, facts that, given F, are more likely on naturalism than theism. So as a classic example, so I just give you one example before I give the response. Is like, let's say that consciousness is evidence for theism, but then we consider the fact that consciousness depends upon physical brains. So therefore, given that extra fact, that would actually be evidence for naturalism. And you can sort of do this across the different strains of evidence. So like the moral knowledge argument, you could say, well, moral knowledge might be evidence for theism, but then when we consider like moral disagreement, that might be evidence for naturalism, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have a few responses. So you can go next slide.
So I want to add something real quick.
Go ahead. Yeah.
One key thing that we can't miss with this is the fallacy of understated evidence is actually supposed to be very strong. What Draper is actually wanting in this objection against theism is that when we actually learn about the specific fact, it actually serves to disconfirm the general fact for theism. So moral agents actually or moral knowledge can actually no longer be evidence for theism, because the specific fact is so disconfirmatory that that the weight of it or the bulk of it actually goes to naturalism. So what we're saying is, we say some general fact F is evidence for theism, but the specific fact actually ends up taking the whole thing over the naturalism. And so a lot of the bulk of our response is actually going to be trying to show that there's an issue with that kind of reasoning.
Okay, so go ahead. So I guess the first thing and me and Tim will be both responding to this objection. And so I guess the first thing to start off here is that in order for the fallacy of understated evidence to be successful, the naturalist must show that the evidence for theism actually depends on the evidence for naturalism, that the first order data which is expected on theism is overcome by some higher order or specific evidence that the theistic paradigm or some sort of theistic narrative cannot address, right? So consider that we talked about earlier in the presentation how we can model theistic explanation in terms of narrative probability, right? So theist giving it sort of a story that accounts for the total evidence, right? So the theist, I would say, can answer this objection by filling out the full context of the evidence. So this is something that Swinburne himself has done, specifically in regards to consciousness and moral agents living in a public environment. If you want to see the full explanation of that, see chapter 6 of The Existence of God, right? And what he does there is he sort of gives a sort of theistic narrative of how the evidence kind of fits together into a nice little package, right? So we can go to the next slide. So I don't know, Tim, did you want to
Yeah,
address
so I can
the?
take over this over.
Yeah.
So what basically is happening is that the naturalist is pointing out some fact that is a consequence of some precondition. Remember that when we talk about general facts for theism, what we're talking about is these are preconditions, and preconditions are evidence for theism. So consciousness, right, is a precondition for moral agents and things of that sort, and rational thought, right? Um, the existence of an orderly complex universe is a precondition for fine tuning and things of that sort, and then anything else that comes about after that, biological evolution, and et cetera, and so forth. And so if the precondition itself is more likely on theism, given how we've laid out the framework for modeling theistic evidence, then we actually have to look at things in terms of the outcome space, the total outcome space, not just in terms of one specific strand of data. So, for example, let's start with the first one, the moral agent's outcome space. Let's say that the outcome space is just the total space of outcomes, right? Right. You're flipping a coin and you can write down the total space of outcomes of heads and tails and things of that sort. So it's not a very complicated concept there. So let's say that the total moral agent's outcome space is that you get moral virtue, but then you also get moral evil. The naturalist is going to say, well, because there's moral evil, and God could have created moral agents in such a way where they only have dispositions towards the good, then it's actually much more friendlier to naturalism that we have moral agents that do good and evil, that do horrific moral acts. And so this actually fits much better with naturalism, and so therefore that's actually evidence for naturalism. Well, then my question for that is, okay, so let's say that I grant you that moral evil disconfirms theism, but we have to look in terms of the total moral agent's outcome space. If the moral agents are evidence for theism, then theism is going to get the greater proportion of the moral agent's outcome space. And so what we have to do is we have to zoom out. We have to look, okay, well, I can still say that naturalism can get some of the moral evil, but it doesn't mean that it gets the overwhelming amount of the entire moral agent's outcome space. That'd be fallacious. Because theism has as its evidence moral agents, then theism is going to get the greater proportion of the moral agent's outcome space, and then we can give a sliver of that to naturalism because it is more probable on theism that there be moral agents. So we can allow disconfirmation, but it's not totally disconfirming theism. It's not even disconfirming theism in terms of 0.5 probability. It's just a little bit. But the majority of it theism has. So remember, we have to look at what's the numerator and what's in the denominator. And that can go for everything else, right? And so a way to think about this is if you have two people and one of them gets a 5% raise on their job, and another person on their income, and another person gets a 10% raise on their income, and you ask, well, who's making more money? You might say, oh, well, the person with the 10% raise is actually better off. It's 5% more than the person with the 5% raise. Well, we can't really make that assessment until we know what their income is prior to the raise. So let's say that the person with the 5% raise was actually making $200,000 a year, but the person with the 10% raise is only making 20. Well, then actually the person with $200,000 a year income is actually better off than the person only making $20,000 a year. And that's exactly the logic behind this. We have to look at the total outcome space and then see the relative disconfirmations. And so even if I grant that something like humans only occupying a small area of the universe is like, let's say, evidence for naturalism, that doesn't overturn an orderly complex universe and being evidence for theism, because it has to get the greater proportion of the total orderly universe outcome space. And so if someone like Draper or others who really do trot out this objection want this to go through, they're going to have to show and give an explanation as to why it disconfirms theism so much as to turn the greater proportion of the outcome space over to naturalism. Because the truth of the precondition is preserved over its consequences. And so we're actually aren't understating it. So we're going to need a more formal way, a more logical, formal way of stating the fallacy as to show that the way in which the theist is arguing is actually susceptible or guilty of the fallacy itself. So that's it for my part.
All right, next slide. So just a final response to the understated evidence objection. So for I guess the general strategy that the theist can use is to make a narrative, create some sort of story, or another word is a theodicy, to kind of incorporate the total data, right? So when doing narrative probability, as long as the narrative, so in this case, the theodicy or some story that the theist wants to tell, is consistent with the antecedent probability principles. So again, as long as it's consistent, in this case, with the diffusiveness principle, with the plenitude principle, and the ultimate goodness principle, as long as it's consistent with those, then it doesn't actually decrease the overall probability, because it's entailed from theism that God will create the best kind of world. And if the best kind of world is the best kind of world according to some axiological framework or some theory about what is valuable and disvaluable, then it's not going to decrease overall probability, right? So there's 4 general strategies I would say that theists can use. So the first one is to actually give some outcome space to the naturalist, but show why theism still takes the greater proportion of the outcome space. In that case, then why you could say that this specific fact about E is evidence for naturalism, it's not great evidence. It's actually that the total fact, like let's say the total fact about consciousness is still going to outweigh the fact that consciousness is dependent on brains. That's the first strategy. The second strategy is to give a theistic narrative to show why the specific evidence, so any specific facts that they bring up, doesn't actually disconfirm theism, right? So you can use this when it comes to like arguments from evil, or maybe you can give some reason as to why we're embodied, right? Swinburne himself gives a few of those reasons in his work. The third strategy is to actually give a theistic narrative to show why specific evidence actually favors theism. So this is a strategy employed by Trent Dowdery in his work The Problem of Animal Pain, and he argues that evil is actually evidence for theism, given that that the theodicy, given that he thinks that his theodicy is entailed from theism, and that his theodicy entails evil, and so you get a prediction from there. I don't want to get too much into detail on his theodicy, but that's sort of the third strategy you can go. And then the fourth strategy is actually just to show how you can actually push it back against the naturalist and show how, if we're going to be consistent with the understated evidence objection, that it actually backfires against the naturalist. So when we consider even more specific facts that the naturalist ignores, that those specific facts actually favor theism. So these are the 4 general strategies that the theist can use when it comes to responding to that objection. So next, final slide. So yeah, that's basically our conclusion. So first of all, is we think that modeling theistic evidence in terms of axiology precludes a lot of the naturalistic parodies. And this is, again, a general framework for understanding theism's explanatory power. This is not meant as a decisive cumulative argument for theism, but it's to show how arguments from natural theology, so the arguments that we already do have, can be incorporated into this framework. And when we incorporate it into the framework, it actually is immune from certain objections. So in that case, then, theism is a progressive research program, just like naturalism is. And so I don't know if Tim wants to add anything else.
Yeah,
but
it's really good because
Yeah.
if theism is a progressive research program, what it means is that there's actually more discovery to be made. I sometimes see in online circles that certain atheists or skeptics will object that theists don't have any new evidence. They don't have any new arguments. And I think it's kind of even weird to say, given that their main argument is from evil, and that's an argument that's been around forever. And that ignores the fact that there actually has been a lot of progress in finding more theistic evidence, right? Joshua Shijiwadi, for example, has been coming up and finding strands of evidence from metaphysics, from modality as well as grounding. You had the Plantinga project with the 12 or dozen so arguments for God's existence, right? But I think what our framework does is it really shows that, hey, listen, take axiology, take value into account, and then you can go out into the world and you can actually discover. You can actually go find more valuable things. You can find more reasons as to why things exist that are consonant and consistent and very plausible on theism, given our general approach, given our axiological taxonomy and things of that sort. And so, in a sense, it's actually not even a regressive research program. It's actually something that can be continued. Theism can be expanded. More people can work to discover that if we look through a theistic lens, how well, even more so than we do now, can we understand the world. And so I think that's what our framework does. I think that's what it allows. And I think that there's a lot more discovery that can be done. And so there's actually a future of the theory itself when it's approached from the framework and from the way in which we've come at it today in this presentation.
All right, you guys have any time for questions?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I got time.
Yeah.
Okay. There was only
got a lot?
one super. No, there was one super chat that was sent in earlier, and I wanted to get it on the screen just to get you guys' feedback on it. I don't think it's necessarily on topic, but we'll get to it anyways. I'll read it out loud for those that are just listening. Tangentially relevant question: why do some people have an evil will and some people have a good will? Does God give us our wills, or do we choose our wills? If so, why would we choose an evil will?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question in terms of how we've laid out the presentation today. So really what I think is, if we're going to bottom line this question, I think really what it's asking is, why do we have this thing that in the literature is called morally significant freedom? We have the freedom to choose good, and we have the freedom to choose ill, right? And I think there's a lot of factors that actually are downstream from a lot of the preconditions that we're talked about. I think that we have wills, but I think that to talk about wills in this isolated kind of abstract, like existing in the ether case doesn't really make a lot of sense, because our wills are also greatly connected to, well, who we are. And we're not just beings with wills, we are biological beings with wills. And so unlike God, who isn't pressured from external non-rational influence, we are always being bombarded by external non-rational influence to do certain things. We are always having to strive over our primitive evolutionary animalistic survival instincts, such as fear, anger, right, isolation, and things of that sort. And I think that on theism, it makes a lot of sense as to why there would be this great struggle in having to overcome that. Because in a way, we're actually really able to experientially learn and value becoming greater beings. We are actually in charge of our own evolution, right? We're actually in charge of our own moral making. And so if there was no struggle against these primitive survival emotions, then it wouldn't be hard won. These virtues wouldn't be hard won. They wouldn't be as praiseworthy as they would be as someone who's made themselves into something. And so I think that struggle that's there actually is there in a way to propel us and really see and appreciate the type of people we become when we overcome these lower level states of being, which always correspond to evil, but higher level states of being, such as thankfulness, a constant state of gratitude, a constant state of forgiveness, loving your enemies, as Jesus taught, is always corresponds and correlates to being rational, and not only that, but doing the good. So I think that theism would totally predict that kind of narrative, that kind of story.
Kyle, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Really, I mean, so it is an interesting question in regards to, like, I guess it comes down to, why do we have moral freedom, right? And so I would say, I actually think in this, I'm not a fan of the free will theodicy, but I do agree partially with it in the sense of, like, I think that when it comes to moral making and moral virtues that form on our own moral character in our own unique way, is itself a good, right? Even if that requires some significant, even if that requires, like, we have the ability to choose evil, right? I think our ability to form our own characters and not just to be imposed by them on God is, I think, a good thing, right? And so that sort of explains why our wills are, can be oriented towards evil depending on the context.
Yeah, I kind of want to just say that the reason why we have some people have good will, some people have evil will, is just because they're exercising their freedom. Like, it's just that's ultimately, like, what it comes down to. Because one thing I think about a lot, and I've had people on talk about the problem of evil, and some of these philosophers get really deep into, like, the worst evils that there are, and most of those are, like, moral evils. People that commit all these atrocities, and the Holocaust, and the rape of Nanking, and all these, like, crazy like stories that you hear. And one thing that I think we have a tendency to do is to look at these scenarios and be like, oh, I would never do that. I would never be able to commit an atrocity like that. But I think what history has shown us is that it can happen to anyone. Anyone in that situation might have actually done those things to those people. Mm-hmm. And so I want to say it's not just like people are created with this good will or this bad will. I think that everyone is created with the freedom, and obviously there are constraints on that, and it's more of like a continuum. So some people are really constrained in what they can will because they have got some like mental issue or something like that, or psychosis, or and they've got things that are going to really kind of make them do what they do. But I think those are the majority of those cases are going to be outliers. So most people just have a rational will. They have an ability to make these free choices. And so it's not that God has like created a good will or a bad will. It's rather that God has created us with significant moral freedom. So
right, exactly.
Go ahead, Tim. I mean, sorry.
I had a question that I wanted to kind of ask y'all where you would put this in your taxonomy of the evidence for theism. So I don't think I haven't seen any more super chats come in. The stream's already pretty long. So what we'll probably end up doing is I'll just ask this question that I've got, and then we can end out the stream. So the question I've got is, for a long time I've been thinking about a sort of meta type of evidence for theism, or for not just for theism, but for Christianity specifically, which goes something like this. So to me, there are days and times when I feel like the evidence for Christianity or the evidence for theism is kind of ambiguous. Like you could go either way with it sometimes. Some atheists, they've got, like, if you actually engage the work of someone like Graham Oppy, it's like this guy kind of knows what he's talking about. Like it does kind of seem like he's got some really good responses to these arguments, and so I can kind of see like how someone reasonable and rational would go that way. So the evidence, I think, this is kind of like a datum that I'm looking at, is like the evidence is somewhat ambiguous. Like you can be rational and go any direction. But then the question is, how expected is that data that the evidence is ambiguous on the different hypotheses? So to me, it doesn't seem like that's something that I would expect on naturalism. Just like I wouldn't expect evil on naturalism, I wouldn't expect the evidence to be ambiguous given naturalism. But on Christianity, it kind of seems like that would make sense. And I know we haven't been talking about Christianity specifically here today. So, but I am curious, like what category that type of consideration, like where would that fit in? Would that just be in the alethic domain, like in the truth, or would it be in beauty? Or
so I think one thing that we forgot to say, I don't know if Kyle or I said it. If we did, I didn't catch it. But the taxonomy also allows, just like for any taxonomic system, it allows for overlap. So I think that this could definitely overlap with maybe all three or all two, meaning alethic and moral, right? Because I think it's kind of reminiscent of the idea of like, why would God create a world where there's like rational atheists like Graham Oppy or whatever?
Yeah, like rational disagreement or.
Yeah, exactly. And stuff, if God, we have this idea that, God wants everyone to believe the same propositions or whatever. But it's like, well, we can actually see that there's great moral value and great alethic value in actually having that, right? And so I would say that there might be just some overlap with that. Just from face value and me just first talking about it, that's kind of how I would see it. Kyle, I don't know what you think.
No, yeah. So what I would say is, so the question, I guess
it's kind of related to the argument from divine hiddenness. It's kind of related to that.
Yeah.
Right. But it sounds like to me, it's like, why would God allow there to be atheism to be rational to some people? Right. Mm-hmm. Like, why do you have like such sophisticated defenses of atheism if theism were true? Right. And I would say that just as we can have moral values, we can also grow what's called intellectual values. And so because intellectual virtues are in the alethic domain, then that's what I would say. But also because there's moral agents involved, then there is kind of an overlap between those two domains. And so in that case, I would say that you could say that this piece of evidence that you're presenting would be both alethic and moral, because it has moral agents involved, but also because those moral agents are involved in discoverability and stuff like that. So that's what I would say in response.
All right, we did have another super chat that came in, so we'll get to this one. It's very related to the topic. So Kelton Walker says, if the diffusive property is true and goodness requires him to create, could God still exist eternally even though he hasn't eternally created? Good question.
Right. Okay, so this is a very common objection. I would be very surprised if someone didn't catch on to this. So it's this idea that, it's been traditionally said that, well, God should be able to exist in a world alone. God should be
Hmm.
able to exist in a world where he doesn't create anything, right? And I think that God absolutely has the freedom and the causal capability to do that. The question is God motivated by those states of affairs? Is God motivated to exist alone? God can absolutely exist alone. It's not a limit on power and it's not a limit on freedom. But God, from only rational internal influences, God has countervailing motivations to not exist alone. That's the idea here. And so, in every circumstance and every occasion, God will create, not because of necessity, not because of some external influence, but because of nature of love and how God perceives the truths about value. So that's what I would say.
Mm. There was another question that came in, another super chat. So let me put this one on the screen too, from Jacob B. How can God or Jesus be the best explanation when you don't have the full list of candidate explanations? There's no way to determine that.
Well, I mean, first, sorry. I was going to say, like, with this presentation, we do have, so 3 candidates is theism, naturalism, and axiarchism. So I guess it might be beyond the scope of this video to talk about Jesus specifically, because, I mean, I think a Muslim could sort of adopt our framework as well. So it's not exclusively Christian. Any theist could adopt it. But
Yeah.
I'm curious as what he's referring to when it comes to the full. Is he just talking about like who could be God?
He may be talking about other religions. Yeah. Other versions of theism,
yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, unfortunately, that would be beyond the scope of this video. Although I do have arguments for Christian theism, that's beyond the scope of what I'm doing here. So
the cool thing about also taxonomizing the different grand theories is that every single worldview, every single religion does fit into either three. It either fits into theism, either fits into axiarchism, or it either fits into atheism. And so they can all fit into that. And so basically, you don't have to go through each one. You can just go, okay, well, what's the relative probabilities of these hypotheses being true? And then all the species become invalidated at that point. So that's what it'd be. The way that this comment came off to me is like, we haven't entertained exhaustively all of the explanatory targets to really see like how does the posterior odds like weigh themselves. That's how I took it. I don't know if I'm looking too deep into it or not, but that's how I took it.
Do you guys want to take another question on polytheism?
Sure.
All right, last one. This is the last one for sure. Running decade. How about comparing theism versus polytheism? A multitude of finite, fallible gods could perhaps better explain evil as well as order, etc., or impersonal, necessary being plus finite gods. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I really like this. Yeah, so I think how we would really square our comparative analysis with this is we'd have to look at it holistically. Is theism, infinitary monotheism, more theoretically virtuous than finite godism, let's say? And so we have to look at it. We have to look at its intrinsic probability, right? I think that infinitary monotheism, as the way that I described it, is much more simple and has a greater intrinsic greater intrinsic simplicity and explanatory systematicity than something like finite godism would. So I would say that the prior probability is actually higher for theism than it would be for this, because I am positing a single metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. And it's self-exemplifying, so it doesn't have properties. It's identical to the properties, so you have zero properties. And tropes are can fit within a non-category ontology, so we don't have any categories. And all of my terms in which how I define the properties are all defined. So we have no ideology. So we have zero ideology, we have zero kinds, we have zero properties, and we have one being. I think that is a much simpler hypothesis than some kind of finite godism. So I think the intrinsic probability goes all the way to some infinitary monotheism. And then we have to look at the evidence, which is like, okay, this is what I really enjoyed about Josh Rasmussen's conversation with Philip Goff, which is like, okay, well, then we have to look at the explanations of the various datum, right? And because we know that, well, if we exist in a best possible kind of world, that automatically goes to the kind of theism we're saying, because if we have these finite gods who are very fallible and they can only apprehend some truths or certain truths, it'd be very surprising that we would land in the best possible kind of world, given their resources than theism, who can instantly, whatever God intends will happen. So probability of one versus an ambiguous probability over here. So I that's how I would square it just off the top of my head.
Yeah,
What about you,
and I
Kyle?
also
You've
want,
been sitting over there
yeah.
inquisitive.
No, yeah. So what I would say is a good explanation is one where you can explain a lot from a little, right? So obviously from there, it's pretty obvious that like our type of theism is going to be much, much more simpler than polytheism. Right now, it might depend upon the type of polytheism. If it's an impersonal polytheism where you just have gods that just do whatever, that's not going to explain anything like at all. Now, if you have gods that are oriented towards goodness, it might have some explanatory power, but it's going to lose on intrinsic probability, right? And not only that, but even if you do have gods that do act towards goodness, that's not going to tell you that those gods will actualize the best kind of world, right? So you're going to have to add on, different auxiliary hypotheses in order for the polytheistic, hypothesis to sort of have the same explanatory power as theism would. I would say that it can reach that, but it's going to be at the cost of simplicity, right? So it's going to have to build in a lot of stuff. So yeah, I don't see any way, like even if you have a polytheism where let's say you have like 100 gods that, if you put them all together, the group as a whole is omnipotent and the group as a whole is going to act towards the best kinds of goods. Well, even there, you're still going to lose on intrinsic probability, because if you're having to posit hundreds of gods in order to posit what one god can do, like that just seems to not, at least probabilistically, that just doesn't work, right? Or at least it's going to lose on total probability regardless.
There's a
So
quote
that's what I
from
would say.
There's a quote from Swinburne. I'm trying to like remember what he said. It had to do with the multiverse. And he's like, if you've got to posit like an infinite multiverse, that's like the height of irrationality, something like that. And that kind of that may have a relevance to this question of polytheism. Is that if you've got to posit all of these different gods to do what one god can do, then that just seems a bit of a stretch.
Especially if you look at the scope of our explanatory target, right? Then it's like, then it really starts to hone everything into focus. And I also think that, Rob Coons came on your channel, oh man, maybe 2019, maybe 2020, and he gave arguments to close the gap problem. And he said that, if you have multiple beings with these kinds of powers working together, like you can't guarantee that one will have veto power over the other, trying to kind of cooperate and kind of creating things. And so it'd be very surprising to me that we would live in a very orderly, complex universe that maps on to discoverability for minds, if we had a kind of situation where certain gods could veto the power over other gods or not even cooperate with their wills, right? Because you can't rule that question out at all. So I feel as though that's would also be a problem or a demerit of a kind of polytheist finite goddess view.
I like that term, demerit. Well, guys, it's been awesome. Like, I'm really impressed. You guys did a really good job. And there have been a lot of comments saying that I can't wait to like go back and watch again. So I encourage you, if you've made it to the very end and this is like the first time that you watched it, watch it again. Like, and you may need to watch it more than one time. You may need to watch it multiple times in order to really get it. But if you would like to see either Tim or Kyle back on the show to talk about something, we could have them both back on, just do Q&A the whole time. That might actually be a lot of fun. But let me know in the comments what you guys think about this show and watch it again. But Kyle and Tim, is there anything you'd like to leave with the audience before we close out the show today?
I guess for me, later on today, I don't have an exact time frame yet, but I'm going to be going over the presentation on my channel. I don't know if Tim's going to join me or not. We've kind of been going back and forth on that, but at least me personally, I'm going to be going over the presentation in more detail and sort of like breaking down what it was going over, just in case anything was missed here. So if anyone's interested on that, just go on my channel.
And I've got both of their YouTube channels linked in the description of the video. So if you just open it up real quick, I've got their YouTube channels tagged. So you just click the tag and then it goes directly to their YouTube channel. You can follow them there and subscribe and do all the things. Well, it's been a lot of fun. Tim, did you want to say anything before we end up?
Oh yeah. No, just like thank you for having me on, and thank you for just allowing us to just nerd out on this stream and just not hold back. It just feels really good to just talk and just there's a lot of passion. I don't know if people notice, but there's a lot of passion when I speak about these certain things because this is a culmination of a lot of insights that Kyle and I have had over countless phone calls, numerous email and messenger correspondences with scholars and discussions back and forth to really hone in and master and propagate these ideas that we are presented for today. So it's been really cool to finally go. And this is the final kind of this is the final presentation of everything that we've been working on. And so it's just been, I just had a blast this whole entire time. So if you want to keep up with me, just my link to my channel is in the description, and definitely we'll stay tuned for more. So
all right, guys, thanks for joining. I will see you in the next Capturing Christianity video. I'm actually interviewing tomorrow in person Father Andrew Dalton, who is an expert on the Shroud of Turin. Completely different topic, but he's going to be here in person. I'm going to be doing an in-person interview. I've got a little setup I do in this office when I've got people that come in here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to having that on the channel the next week or so, hopefully. Depends on how long it takes to edit, but look forward to more awesome content at Capturing Christianity. If you have never subscribed to this channel, subscribe. Turn on the bell if you want. You don't have to, but turning on the bell means obviously that you get notified when we post new content. So if today's show has interested you, you're probably going to want to watch like basically everything else that we have, because this is like one of the most advanced shows that we've done in a long time. So if you liked this, then you're probably going to like everything that we put out. So yeah, subscribe. But anyways, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity episode. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?